Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing amphetamine and methamphetamine. Okay, so in this final video what we are going to do is try to understand why amphetamine and methamphetamine cause amphetamine psychosis. Okay, so what we're actually going to be seeing is what's known as the dopamine theory of psychosis, also very much so related to the postulate of aberrant salience. Okay, and indeed it's believed to be the same thing going wrong in schizophrenia which goes wrong when you take amphetamine and methamphetamine, and which leads to the hallucinations and the delusions. Okay, so what causes psychosis then? Well, it's believed to be that dopamine goes up in the striatum, and that is what causes psychosis. So it's believed to be when dopamine goes up in the caudate and the putamen that psychosis occurs, so hallucinations and delusions start. And that theory, it is not just for amphetamine and methamphetamine, but also for schizophrenia. In schizophrenia, it's believed that there's too much dopamine being released into the caudate and the putamen. Okay, when you take amphetamine and methamphetamine, of course, the drugs are activating the dopaminergic input to the putamen and the caudate, and therefore causing a lot more dopamine to be released into these brain areas, and that's what then drives the psychosis. Okay, so it goes further though, our understanding of this. Why does dopamine going up in the putamen and the caudate cause psychosis? Well, it's believed that when dopamine goes up in the caudate and the putamen too high, that these areas of the brain start behaving in a wrong way. They start behaving aberrantly. Okay, now what is the function of the striatum? Well, the function of the striatum is in deciding what is important and what is not. Deciding what processing processes deserve more effort and which processing processes do not deserve more effort. Okay, so let me explain this in a bit more detail. The brain is processing information all the time, and different areas of the brain are processing different thoughts. Okay, so let me show this with a little picture here. So here's a little picture of the brain. So all over the brain you've got different thoughts being processed. So I'll colour these in different colours. So different portions of the brain are processing different thoughts. So different areas of the brain will be having different processing processes occurring. Okay, they'll be processing different thoughts. Right, now what decides which thoughts are important and which thoughts deserve more of the brain to process them? Okay, so maybe a thought at the moment is having a tiny little portion of the brain actually processing it. What decides that that thought, that processing, can have a greater portion of the brain devoted to processing it? Well, it's believed to be the striatum that then amplifies processing, amplifies thoughts basically, amplifies how much area of the brain is actually being devoted to a certain thought. Okay, so it's important then in deciding which thoughts are going to be amplified and which aren't going to be amplified. Now, the idea then in indeed amphetamines and methamphetamine psychosis, and also in schizophrenia, is that when the dopamine is too high in the striatum starts approving thoughts that shouldn't be approved. Thoughts that aren't important and shouldn't be important get importance attached to them because this is functioning wrongly, and then those thoughts are amplified. More of the brain is devoted to those thoughts, and they are amplified up, and they shouldn't be amplified up. This is what is meant by aberrant salience. Salience means the attachment of importance to thoughts. So aberrant attachment of importance to thoughts. Thoughts which shouldn't be amplified are being amplified because the striatum is misfunctioning, because it has too much dopamine in it. Okay, so how then does this cause things like hallucinations? Well, the idea here is very speculative, but the idea is that maybe the portion of our brain that is important in processing auditory information, maybe that all the time has little thoughts occurring which would correspond to hearing things that aren't there. Okay, maybe all of us have actually got portion of our brain that's important in hearing things, important in auditory processing, active all the time and making up little thoughts, maybe for practice, okay, making up little combinations of action potentials that would, if they were amplified up to being important and brought to conscious attention, sound like voices, okay, but usually we don't hear them because the thought isn't getting importance attached to it, it isn't being amplified up, it isn't getting conscious attention brought to it. Okay, so the idea is that maybe our brains are all the time having hallucinations, we're just not consciously aware of it because our striatum is functioning properly and is not attaching importance to these thought processes which aren't actually there and are just potentially the brain practicing, okay, and therefore they're not brought to conscious attention, they're not amplified up. But if the striatum stops functioning correctly because there's too high dopamine in, then these practice thoughts can be amplified up, they can be turned into real auditory thoughts, and they'll be brought to conscious attention, and then you'll hear voices or the equivalent for seeing things, etc. Okay, so that is our sort of current hypothesis of what might underlie the psychosis that is seen in response to amphetamines and methamphetamine, and also in schizophrenia. Okay, so it is believed to be because dopamine is too high in the striatum, and then the striatum doesn't attach importance correctly to things that shouldn't have importance attached to them get far too much importance attached to them, and they are amplified up, that thought process is amplified up, and then it becomes you become consciously aware of it, and that might underlie why you have hallucinations. Okay, so I agree that it is a complicated theory to understand, but that is our current theory of why dopamine going up in the striatum might lead to psychosis. And as I say, it's the theory not just for amphetamine psychosis, but also for schizophrenic psychosis. Okay, right, so that now concludes our discussion of the explanations for the different mental effects of amphetamine and methamphetamine. And with that, I will conclude this video on amphetamine and methamphetamine.